3 weeks on since the London Marathon, where I ran my latest marathon PB, and I also shared a rather dramatically titled video. I ran the hardest run of my life.
Oh God, should not be this hard at this point.
Today I'm heading out for my longest run since the marathon, and I'm going to talk through a little bit of a debrief. So some of the key stats, what went really well, what didn't go quite so well, and what I'd change next time. Oh, and if you haven't watched the video, by the way, I'll link it at the top. Let's go.
Go. Okay, first things first, a little bit of a chat through some of the key stats. Not going to dwell on loads, just really wanted to talk through the pace strategy and then heart rate basically. So kicking off with the pace strategy. So I've always been quite honest, my target for London Marathon was a sub 3:45 hour marathon. So I would have to have ran about 8.5 minute mile pace. So my whole 16-week training block was based on that and went pretty well. However, the 2 weeks leading up to London, I was quite unwell, so it meant the taper was thrown off a little bit. It affected a few of the things that I'll go on to talk about later. But it basically meant that although I still wanted to target that, I think obviously deep down I knew it wasn't quite realistic. On the day I headed out with the plan of trying to get as close to an 8:45 minute mile as possible, and then honestly just see how it went. So I'm pretty good at knowing how I'm feeling, and I was really kind of taking in and checking in with myself throughout. I wanted to run it as fast as I could, that was always the goal, but because I had been so unwell, I knew that physically my body had had a little bit of a battering. I'll be honest, my biggest concern was genuinely, sounds dramatic, but doing damage to my body, and also blowing up and having to drop out. So I was constantly kind of checking in, you know, with my heart rate and how I was feeling. So very early on I realised that this was not going to be a 3:45 marathon, and I was okay with that. I really just at that point desperately wanted to get round. So I usually run a negative split, that's how I prefer to run a race, it's kind of how I've always done it. But yeah, that just was not happening. Completely emptied the tank in a safe way. Oh, just another little walk up this hill. A little walking break. It's really hot in England this week. So yeah, I find it interesting to compare the pace graph to my last marathon in Chicago. The strategy was totally different. I'd had an injury through the Chicago marathon training block and I didn't know how it was going to hold up. So that strategy was very calm, very cool, get the first 20 miles done, and then if I felt good, go for it. As you'll see from the pace graph, felt great. So I had the most crazy negative split for Chicago. Felt amazing, most enjoyable marathon I've ever ran. And at the time that was a PB and my first ever sub 4 marathon, so that was epic. And if you look at the contrast between London, although London was quicker, a couple of minutes quicker, you can see that it was obviously a lot harder and I was basically getting slower and slower. Not by a huge amount, but it shows me that on the day I gave everything I could, in my opinion. Yeah, whereas Chicago, completely different pace strategy. I'll be honest, for me, neither are ideal, but I kind of went into both of those marathons in not perfect circumstances. So yeah, that was the pace strategy. I guess I wasn't able to go with what I had on plan, but I adapted on the day. When I tackle the next marathon, I don't want the graph to look like it did in London. I really want to get back onto that negative split. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you think I should have done anything differently or if you think I've had an absolute disaster there. But yeah, overall, I was happy. Right, let's get running again. Okay, so next little bit of stats was the heart rate data. Now this is where I could really tell that I wasn't properly recovered from my illness. So if you have a look at the comparison between my Chicago heart rate and my London Marathon heart rate, obviously London was a couple of minutes quicker, but you can see some of the really rogue, really high heart rates that I was hitting during London. Now, being totally honest, I didn't have a heart rate strap on. It was measured through my Garmin wrist strap, which, you know, is not as reliable as using a heart rate strap. However, I used it for both. Let's put aside how accurate we think it is. It's a comparison using the same measurable tool. Equally, when I looked back at some of my heart rate data from some of my longest runs leading up to London, again, significant differences. I mean, I guess it's probably going to be higher on race day anxiety is a little bit higher, nerves, excitement, But yeah, there were some crazy high heart rates that came in for me. So when I hit mile 4 or 5, I'd just done a little bit of talking to camera after the 5k marker. Was excited. The 2 different waves had just merged. And I looked down and my watch said 2:06. I mean, again, I question the accuracy of that. But I have to say that scared me a little bit and did get me questioning, was it safe to carry on and get around? And did I need to, drop the pace? Luckily it did drop back down again and I eased into it. But yeah, some crazy heart rate data for me. It does show that physically, things weren't ideal for me that day, but is what it is. But yeah, some interesting stats for me to look into there. Okay, so I'm trying to keep this relatively short and sweet. So those are the 2 key bits of stats I'm kind of interested in and have the data on to share. I'm going to get a few more miles banked here, recover a little bit, get the heart rate back down, and I'll talk through very briefly a bit of a reflection on what went well, what didn't go so well, and what that means for next time round. Oh dear, this is bloody lovely. Okay, what went well? I really can't moan too much. I got a marathon PB. It's the fastest I've ever run that distance. It was nearly 8 minutes quicker than I've ever run the London Marathon, because I've done it twice before. And obviously, being poorly in the lead up to it did mean there were factors that were outside of control that influenced what didn't go quite so well. However, I think it's also important to reflect that there were still things that I can't just blame on being a bit poorly. And I'll come on to it, but there were elements like fueling and other things that I've just not quite got right. And I think it's important to not just put all of this in there, I was poorly, blame it on that. And let me be clear, I am not disappointed. I got a marathon PB, it was epic, I'm so proud. But how the training block went, how fit I was feeling leading up to it, all of these things, I definitely feel I could have run quicker. But I'm happy, so just to clarify that. So what went well? So although I was just saying I was really happy I still got a PB, being brutally honest, on the actual day and the few days leading up to it, not a massive amount went well, which I'll come on to. But what did go well, and what I can reflect really positively on, is the actual training block itself. I had a few ups and downs, there are a few missed sessions. I had a historical injury that crept in a little bit. I'm so pleased with how I managed it, and I actually put in place things that I've learned previously. So I got a lot more strength training in, actually stuck to it. When I felt that niggle creep back in, I was really sensible, stripped back, got back to the physio, focused throughout the training block, rest, recovery, really practice fueling. So what went well? Honestly, on the day, not a lot. Training block, really pleased with, which I think is really important. That dog. Oh, so goddamn cute. Right, what didn't go quite so well? The biggest thing was my fueling. And that's disappointing because if you'd have watched any of my videos through my training block, it was something I really focused on. Basically, this always seems to happen on race day. It's hard to explain, it's not a stitch, stomach cramps. I just really struggled to get any decent fueling down, which basically meant that I was really underfueled compared to what I should have been. So over the whole marathon distance, which took me 3 hours 53 minutes and a bit, I only had 2 gels and about 6 Vela Forte chews. So that comes to around 104 grams of carbs, which is not great, not ideal. So should be taken on board. It varies depending on what kind of research you read, but 30-60 grams per hour. So I should have had arguably at least double what I had. It just wasn't going down well. My tummy was cramping. The more fuel I was taking on, that was getting worse. So I basically made the decision that I'd rather be underfueled than my tummy get any worse. Whether that was the right decision or not, I'll never know. But this needs to change for the next marathon training block, or the next race, to be honest. Hydration was equally as poor. So I had about 500 ml of water mixed with electrolytes. Again, should be having way more than that, up to 400 to 800 mil an hour, dependent on your pace, size, sweat rate, etc. But I didn't have enough. There's obviously a potential that was influenced by my illness. Hadn't been able to eat or drink that well leading up to it, so it was probably that. But also, I've got to be honest with myself, I just haven't got my fueling right. Never have. It's all fine during training, but it's on race day, so don't know, is there something psychological there? Am I feeling anxious? Am I getting carried away with the crowds and not really sticking religiously to the timings? Don't know, probably all of the above, but it needs work is what I'm saying. Okay, so the last little bit on what didn't go quite so well, and that was sleep, rest and recovery leading up to race day. And it's something that I usually nail. So looking at like my data for the week leading up to Chicago, up until we travelled and had all the jet lag and whatnot, I nailed my sleep, good rest, and I felt very recovered. All my Garmin body battery health data, smashed it. Not the same this time round. And if I'm being really honest with myself, I did too much. Although I was still prioritising length of sleep, I was doing too much in the days and weeks leading up to it that was tiring me physically and mentally, which meant that my sleep quality just wasn't as good. And again, this was demonstrated by my heart rate variability data. And I know being poorly would have affected that, but I guess it's just really demonstrated to me how important that is. It's obvious really, but I find it interesting looking at the stats. So the cherry on top was the night before the marathon. I'd had a really busy day the day before, as some of you will have seen in my expo video. Walked too much, travel was stressful, just generally busy. And I was tired, I was anxious, and although I had a great day, probably wasn't the ideal pre-marathon day. And I think that contributed to the fact that the night before the marathon, I got 4.5 hours sleep, and it wasn't great quality sleep. So yeah, that was the cherry on top, that I woke up feeling fatigued and nervous, to be honest. And I realised that the sleep the night before can be, to a degree, out of your control. And that's why I think that the 2 or more weeks leading up to it are so important, to get that recovery almost banked, so that the night before, even if you're not sleeping, you're still comfortable with the fact that you're still resting your body and you've got, your body in a good physiological place for the run. And I'd done none of those things, so yeah, wasn't ideal. Okay, so finishing things up here, and I don't want this to feel like a pessimistic, moany video. It is not. As I've said, very pleased with how everything went. You've just got to look back, and if you do want to keep improving and getting stronger, quicker, faster, whatever your goals are, which I want to do, you need to look back and be honest with yourself and pick out bits which you're proud of, bits which you think you nailed, but also bits that you can maybe do a little bit better or focus on next time around. So that's the purpose of this little bit of reflection for me. So what is next? Well, I've done 3 marathons in the last 18 months, which is a lot for me. Maybe not a lot for some people, it's a lot for me. So definitely not another marathon. Or will I? Let's see, shall we? For now, I'm just going to enjoy the rest of this run, enjoy the sunshine, and get in the garden when I get back.